When modern sorcerers speak about the Heian Era, they often describe it as the golden age of sorcery, a title that carries a sense of grandeur and admiration. It evokes images of legendary battles, extraordinary techniques, and powerful individuals whose names would echo through history for centuries. Yet the truth behind that title is far more unsettling than it first appears, because the Heian Era was not golden in the way most people imagine. It was not an age of peace, prosperity, or stability. It was an age where humanity stood closer to extinction than most people realized, and where survival itself often depended upon the existence of a handful of individuals powerful enough to stand against horrors beyond ordinary comprehension. The world during this period was fundamentally different from the one seen in modern Jujutsu Kaisen. Curses were more numerous, more violent, and often far more difficult to exorcise. Negative emotions flowed endlessly through society, feeding monstrous entities that lurked in forests, mountains, abandoned shrines, and even within crowded cities. For ordinary people, life was filled with uncertainty because death could arrive without warning and in forms that few could understand. A family could disappear overnight after encountering a curse too powerful for local sorcerers to handle. Entire villages might become abandoned after a series of inexplicable tragedies that no one dared investigate. Stories spread rapidly, but answers were scarce, and fear gradually became an unavoidable part of daily life. Most ordinary people never saw curses directly, yet they lived with their consequences constantly. Strange disappearances, unexplained deaths, and mysterious disasters became woven into the fabric of society. Many people attributed these tragedies to angry spirits, divine punishment, or forces beyond human understanding. Hidden from public view, however, a brutal conflict was unfolding every day between sorcerers and curses, a conflict that demanded immense sacrifices from everyone involved. To become a sorcerer during the Heian Era was not considered a path toward glory. It was a life sentence. Young sorcerers entered a world where death was expected rather than feared. Missions that would be considered extraordinarily dangerous in later generations were treated as ordinary responsibilities. Powerful curses roamed freely across the country, and even talented sorcerers often failed to survive long enough to enjoy the reputations they earned. Strength mattered more than ideals, because ideals offered little protection against enemies capable of killing entire groups of experienced fighters. This environment shaped Jujutsu society in profound ways. Families blessed with powerful inherited techniques became increasingly influential because exceptional abilities dramatically increased a person's chances of survival. Bloodlines gained importance. Clan politics became more ruthless. Marriages were arranged according to strategic interests. Children carrying valuable techniques were viewed not simply as family members, but as assets whose futures could determine the status of an entire household. Over time, the foundations of the great clans began taking shape. Power concentrated within a relatively small number of families, whose inherited techniques distinguished them from ordinary sorcerers. Prestige became inseparable from strength, and strength became inseparable from survival. This system produced extraordinary individuals, but it also created immense pressure. Sorcerers carried the expectations of their families, the burdens of tradition, and the constant awareness that a single mistake could cost them everything. Even among these elite groups, however, nobody felt truly safe. The Heian Era possessed a brutal hierarchy where someone stronger always seemed to exist. A talented sorcerer might dominate dozens of opponents and still encounter an enemy capable of ending their life effortlessly. Victories brought prestige, but they did not guarantee security. The strongest individuals in one generation could become forgotten casualties in the next. And this uncertainty created a culture obsessed with power. That obsession is one of the reasons the Heian Era produced such extraordinary figures. People pushed themselves to unimaginable limits because weakness was terrifying. Sorcerers devoted their entire lives to mastering techniques because failure often meant death. Families preserved secret knowledge for generations because losing an inherited advantage could mean losing everything. The result was an era overflowing with talent, unlike anything that came afterward. The strongest sorcerers in history emerged during these years. Ancient techniques reached levels of refinement that later generations could barely replicate. Battles between elite fighters reshaped landscapes and became legends repeated centuries later. Yet alongside these stories of greatness existed another reality, one far darker and far more frightening. Because if the Heian Era represented the peak of Jujutsu sorcery, it also produced the most terrifying existence the world had ever known. There are many powerful characters throughout Jujutsu Kaisen. Some possess overwhelming cursed energy. Some wield techniques so complex that even experienced sorcerers struggle to understand them. Some are remembered as legends whose accomplishments shaped history itself. Ryomen Sukuna stands apart from all of them. The fear surrounding Sukuna is unlike the fear inspired by ordinary villains, because his existence challenges the very idea of what a sorcerer is supposed to be. Historical records describe him as a calamity rather than a man. Legends portray him as something closer to a natural disaster than a human being. Even centuries after his death, modern sorcerers continue treating fragments of his body as catastrophically dangerous objects capable of destroying countless lives. What makes this especially remarkable is that Sukuna did not emerge during a weak era. He appeared during the strongest era in history. The Heian Era produced countless elite sorcerers, many of whom possessed abilities that would dominate later generations. Entire clans dedicated themselves to mastering jujutsu. Powerful fighters emerged from every corner of society. The world contained more talent, more experience, and more raw strength than perhaps any other point in history. And still, Sukuna stood above them all. Sorcerers challenged him and failed. Powerful groups united against him and failed. Generations of fighters attempted to overcome him and failed. As stories of his strength spread throughout the country, fear gradually transformed into something deeper. People no longer asked, whether Sukuna could be defeated. They began asking whether defeating him was ever possible at all. This question would haunt the Heian Era for years. Because the golden age of sorcery was not defined solely by its greatest heroes. It was defined by the terrifying reality that even in humanity's strongest age, there existed one being so overwhelmingly powerful that history itself would never forget his name. Long before names like Gojo, Zenin, and Kamo came to dominate the modern Jujutsu world, the foundations of their power were being laid during the Heian Era. This was not a process that happened overnight, nor was it the result of simple political ambition. The rise of the great clans was born from necessity, because in a world where curses could destroy entire communities and powerful sorcerers died young, families possessing exceptional abilities naturally became centers of influence. The Heian Era rewarded strength more than almost any other period in history. Survival depended upon it. Reputation depended upon it. Entire bloodlines rose or fell according to the abilities they could pass to future generations. While ordinary people feared curses from a distance, sorcerer families faced these horrors directly. And over time, they began organizing themselves around the belief that inherited power was the surest path toward survival. This belief would eventually shape the entire structure of Jujutsu society. Families blessed with extraordinary cursed techniques carefully protected their bloodlines. Children born with rare abilities became immensely valuable because they represented the continuation of a family's legacy and influence. Marriages were arranged strategically. Secret techniques were guarded obsessively. Traditions developed that emphasized obedience, discipline, and the preservation of inherited power above almost everything else. From these circumstances emerged the earliest forms of what later generations would call the three great clans. The ancestors of the Gojo clan distinguished themselves through abilities so rare that they quickly became legendary. Although the Six Eyes and Limitless technique would not always appear together, their existence transformed the balance of power whenever they did. Even during the Heian Era, sorcerers understood that a member of the Gojo family, possessing both gifts, represented an almost unimaginable force, someone capable of altering the course of history through sheer ability alone. The Kamo clan rose to prominence through intelligence, adaptability, and mastery of blood manipulation, a technique as elegant as it was terrifying. Their abilities allowed them to control blood with incredible precision, creating weapons, altering the battlefield, and developing combat strategies that few opponents could anticipate. Over time, the clan gained a reputation for producing disciplined and highly skilled sorcerers who valued tradition and strategic thinking. The Zenin clan followed a different path. More than any other major family, the Zenin measured worth through strength. Power was not simply respected within the clan, it was expected. Those born with exceptional cursed techniques were celebrated, while those considered weak often faced harsh treatment and social exclusion. This philosophy created many formidable sorcerers, but it also fostered a culture where ambition and cruelty frequently existed side by side. The seeds of those attitudes were already visible during the Heian Era. As these clans expanded their influence, they gradually became more than families. They became institutions capable of shaping laws, directing sorcerer society, and determining who received opportunities within the Jujutsu world. Their decisions affected countless lives, and their rivalries often carried consequences far beyond personal disputes. Yet the rise of the great clans also revealed something deeply uncomfortable about Jujutsu society. Power was becoming hereditary. A person's future increasingly depended upon the family into which they were born. Exceptional talent could occasionally overcome this system, but inherited techniques provided advantages that were impossible to ignore. Children carrying prestigious bloodlines entered the world with expectations, opportunities, and responsibilities that others could never easily obtain. This hierarchy created both greatness and suffering. The pressure placed upon talented children could be immense. Families expected perfection because failure threatened not only the individual, but the reputation of the entire clan. Sorcerers grew up carrying burdens that ordinary people could scarcely imagine. They trained relentlessly, competed constantly, and lived with the knowledge that their value was often tied directly to their abilities. For some, these expectations became motivation. For others, they became chains. The irony is that while the great clans accumulated influence and prestige, the world around them was growing increasingly dangerous. Powerful curses continued emerging. Ancient techniques pushed combat to unimaginable heights. Sorcerers fought desperate battles whose details would eventually become legends. The Heian Era was producing extraordinary individuals at an astonishing rate, but it was also creating threats unlike anything humanity had faced before. Among these threats, one name gradually began spreading throughout the country. At first, the stories seemed impossible to believe. Witnesses spoke of a figure possessing overwhelming cursed energy and a grotesque appearance unlike anything they had ever seen. Some described him as a monster, wearing the shape of a man. Others insisted he had once been human, but had transcended ordinary existence through sheer power. Accounts varied wildly, yet one detail remained consistent across every story. Nobody who challenged him emerged victorious. The strongest sorcerers attempted to oppose him and disappeared. Entire groups confronted him and failed. Techniques that had defined prestigious bloodlines for generations proved ineffective against him. As rumors spread, fear began reaching even the most influential clans. For perhaps the first time, families who had spent centuries accumulating power were forced to confront a terrifying possibility. The hierarchy they had built, the techniques they had preserved, and the strength they valued above all else might still be insufficient against the calamity slowly rising before them. That calamity was Ryomen Sukuna. And as his legend continued growing, the golden age of sorcery would begin transforming into something far more frightening. Because the strongest era in history was about to meet the strongest being it had ever produced. Among all the mysteries that surround the Heian Era, none is more fascinating than the origins of Ryomen Sukuna. Even centuries after his death, modern sorcerers possess surprisingly little certainty about who he truly was before becoming the figure feared throughout history as the king of curses. Records from the Heian Era are fragmented. Legends often contradict one another, and many stories have become so distorted over time that separating fact from myth is nearly impossible. Yet perhaps that uncertainty is part of what makes Sukuna so terrifying. Because the less people know about where he came from, the more unimaginable his existence becomes. What is generally accepted is that Sukuna was originally human. This detail alone surprises many people, especially those introduced to him in the modern era. The 4 arms, the second face, the overwhelming cursed energy, and the almost inhuman confidence with which he carries himself make it easy to forget that Sukuna was not born as a curse. He was once a man living during the Heian Era, a period already overflowing with extraordinary sorcerers and terrifying battles. Yet even in an age remembered as the golden age of sorcery, Sukuna stood apart so dramatically that history struggled to categorize him. Many descriptions portray him less as an individual and more as a natural disaster. Sorcerers did not speak of fighting Sukuna in the same way they spoke about fighting ordinary opponents. Confronting him was often described as confronting an overwhelming force of nature, something whose existence seemed fundamentally unfair. His cursed energy was vast beyond comprehension. His techniques displayed a level of refinement that few others could hope to achieve. Most frightening of all was the ease with which he exercised his power, as though abilities that others spent entire lifetimes mastering required no effort from him whatsoever. The physical appearance associated with Sukuna only intensified the fear surrounding him. Historical depictions frequently portray him with 4 arms and 2 faces, an appearance so unusual that many theories emerged attempting to explain it. Some believe he was born with these features. Others argue that his body transformed as his cursed energy grew to impossible levels. There are even interpretations suggesting that Sukuna existed outside the normal boundaries of humanity entirely, occupying a place somewhere between man, curse, and something else altogether. The truth remains uncertain. What is undeniable is the effect he had on the people around him. Fear followed Sukuna wherever his name was spoken. Villages dreaded rumors of his movements. Sorcerers measured their own abilities against stories of his strength and found themselves wanting. The most talented fighters of the era, individuals who would have been celebrated as legends under different circumstances, often became supporting characters in histories dominated by Sukuna's existence. Yet reducing Sukuna to a monster alone would be an oversimplification. One of the most fascinating aspects of his character is the philosophy that guides him. Sukuna does not appear motivated by revenge, justice, political ambition, or even the desire to conquer the world. He simply exists according to his own desires, completely indifferent to the expectations, morals, or suffering of others. Strength, from Sukuna's perspective, grants absolute freedom. The powerful may pursue whatever they wish, while the weak exist at their mercy. This worldview is ruthless, but it is also remarkably consistent. Sukuna does not pretend to care about ideals he does not believe in. He does not justify cruelty through noble intentions. He does not seek approval. He does not crave recognition because he assumes his superiority as an unquestionable fact. His confidence borders on arrogance. Yet throughout history, very few individuals have possessed the strength necessary to challenge that arrogance. This philosophy likely developed during the Heian Era itself. After all, Sukuna lived in a world obsessed with power. Sorcerers constantly competed for influence. Clans preserved bloodlines to maintain advantages over rivals. Survival often depended upon strength, and weakness frequently invited suffering. The difference is that while most people struggled within this system, Sukuna transcended it entirely. He became so overwhelmingly powerful that ordinary rules simply stopped applying to him. This may explain why Sukuna often appears strangely detached from human emotions. He does not seek companionship because he does not need it. He does not fear loneliness because nobody exists on his level. He does not crave validation because his strength already confirms everything he believes about himself. There is an enormous emptiness hidden beneath this perspective. But Sukuna never treats that emptiness as a problem. He embraces it completely. This is part of what makes him such an unsettling figure. Many villains seek something. Sukuna seeks nothing. He desires pleasure, entertainment, and the freedom to act according to his whims. But he does not appear burdened by regrets or haunted by ambitions left unfulfilled. He moves through history with the confidence of someone who has already accepted exactly who he is and sees no reason to change. The people of the Heian Era found this terrifying, not simply because Sukuna was powerful, but because he seemed impossible to understand. How do you reason with someone who rejects morality entirely? How do you threaten someone who fears nothing? How do you defeat someone who views every battle as little more than entertainment? These questions haunted the strongest sorcerers of the era. Because as Sukuna's reputation continued growing, it became increasingly clear that he was not merely another powerful fighter emerging during the golden age of sorcery. He was something unprecedented, a being so overwhelmingly strong that the greatest age of Jujutsu would eventually be remembered not only for the heroes it produced, but for the terrifying reality that even its strongest warriors were forced to live in the shadow of Ryomen Sukuna. As Sukuna's power continued growing, fear began spreading throughout the Heian Era in a way few other figures in history had ever inspired. This was not the fear of a cunning political leader plotting from the shadows, nor was it the fear of a curse emerging unexpectedly from humanity's darkest emotions. Sukuna was something far more disturbing because his existence was undeniable. His power was overwhelming. And no matter how many sorcerers challenged him, the outcome seemed to remain the same. The strongest era in the history of Jujutsu had encountered an opponent it could not overcome. This fact alone is difficult to fully appreciate because the Heian Era was overflowing with extraordinary talent. powerful clans were at the height of their influence. Ancient, cursed techniques had reached astonishing levels of refinement. Elite sorcerers dedicated their entire lives to mastering abilities that would become legendary centuries later. In any other period, these individuals would have stood uncontested at the top of the Jujutsu world. Yet Sukuna existed above all of them. Historical accounts repeatedly emphasize this point because it almost defies belief. Sorcerers possessing generations of inherited knowledge confronted him and failed. Groups of elite fighters united their strength and failed. Techniques regarded as masterpieces of jujutsu proved ineffective against him. Even when opponents demonstrated remarkable skill, Sukuna often defeated them with an ease that felt almost cruel. This overwhelming superiority gradually changed the psychology of the era itself. For generations, sorcerers had believed that enough talent, enough training, and enough determination could overcome almost any obstacle. Sukuna challenged that belief. He represented a terrifying possibility that many people were reluctant to acknowledge, namely, that there could exist an individual so overwhelmingly superior that no amount of effort from others would ever be enough. This is one of the reasons Sukuna became more than an enemy. He became a symbol. He represented the terrifying limits of human potential, the realization that even during humanity's strongest age, there were boundaries that could not be crossed. Sorcerers who spent their entire lives pursuing strength suddenly found themselves questioning whether strength alone was meaningful when confronted by someone like Sukuna. The irony is that Sukuna himself never appeared particularly interested in proving anything. Unlike many powerful figures in fiction, he does not seek recognition because he assumes his superiority as obvious. He does not conquer nations because political authority holds little appeal for him. He does not attempt to reshape society according to some grand ideology. His actions are driven almost entirely by personal desire, amusement, and an unwavering belief that the strong have the right to live exactly as they please. This philosophy made him extraordinarily dangerous. Many villains can be negotiated with because they desire something specific. Some seek revenge. Some seek justice. Some seek power. Sukuna seeks freedom. And a person who values absolute freedom above all else is nearly impossible to control. The suffering of others rarely affects him. Moral arguments fail because he rejects morality as a meaningful limitation. Threats fail because he fears almost nothing. He views life itself through a brutally simple lens, where strength grants freedom and weakness carries consequences. From his perspective, this is not cruelty. It is merely reality. The Heian Era desperately wanted to prove him wrong. That desire eventually led to one of the most significant events in Jujutsu history. The strongest sorcerers of the age united against Sukuna. Unfortunately, many details surrounding this conflict have been lost over time. The surviving records remain frustratingly vague, leaving modern readers to piece together fragments of stories passed down across centuries. What is consistently emphasized, however, is the sheer scale of the effort required to oppose him. This was not an isolated duel. This was not a rivalry between two individuals. It was an entire era struggling against a single man. Elite sorcerers challenged Sukuna with techniques refined over generations. Powerful clans committed their greatest talents to the battle. Fighters whose names would become legends risked everything attempting to end his reign of terror. The combined strength assembled against him would have overwhelmed almost any other enemy in history. And still, Sukuna remained undefeated. That outcome fundamentally altered how people viewed him. He was no longer merely the strongest sorcerer. He was no longer merely a terrifying opponent. He became something closer to a myth, while still being terrifyingly real. Stories about Sukuna spread across the country, growing darker with each retelling. Some described him standing amidst countless defeated enemies without sustaining serious injuries. Others claimed his cursed energy alone was enough to overwhelm experienced fighters before battle even began. Although exaggerations undoubtedly existed, the truth was frightening enough that embellishment hardly seemed necessary. Even centuries later, modern sorcerers continue speaking about Sukuna with a mixture of fear and respect. That reaction says a great deal. The Jujutsu world has witnessed countless powerful curses. It has produced remarkable sorcerers. Entire generations have risen and fallen. Yet Sukuna remains the standard against which overwhelming power is measured. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of his story is that he never behaves like someone carrying an enormous burden. Many powerful characters in Jujutsu Kaisen struggle with isolation, expectations, or the consequences of their abilities. Sukuna appears almost liberated by his strength. He embraces his role completely, refusing to apologize for what he is, and refusing to compromise for the comfort of others. There is something deeply frightening about that certainty. Most people carry doubts. Sukuna does not. Most people seek meaning. Sukuna creates his own. Most people are shaped by the world around them. Sukuna bends the world to his desires and dismisses anyone too weak to resist. This mindset explains why he remained such a terrifying force throughout the Heian Era. It was not merely his cursed energy or his techniques that frightened people. It was the realization that Sukuna existed outside the values that governed ordinary society. The concepts of duty, sacrifice, compassion, and justice held little influence over him because he recognized no authority greater than his own will. And perhaps that is why the strongest era in history ultimately failed to defeat him. Because the Heian Era produced countless exceptional sorcerers. But even among those legends, there existed assumptions about morality, responsibility, and human limits. Sukuna rejected all of those assumptions completely. He embraced only strength, freedom, and his own desires, creating a worldview so ruthless and uncompromising that generations of sorcerers would spend centuries trying to understand how such a being could have ever existed at all. For someone who believes so completely in strength, Ryomen Sukuna has surprisingly little interest in forming relationships. Throughout both the Heian Era and the modern story of Jujutsu Kaisen, he rarely shows attachment to anyone around him. Human suffering means very little to him. Human ambitions amuse him more than they impress him. Even powerful sorcerers, who dedicate their lives to surpassing him, are often dismissed with indifference, as though their greatest achievements barely deserve his attention. Sukuna exists according to his own desires, detached from society, and unconcerned with how others perceive him. Yet amid this overwhelming isolation, one figure has remained at his side for centuries. That person is Urame. The relationship between Sukuna and Urame is one of the most mysterious and fascinating dynamics in the entire series, because it raises questions that have never been fully answered. Why would someone as self-sufficient and arrogant as Sukuna tolerate another person remaining close to him for so long? And perhaps, even more intriguingly, why would Urame devote centuries of unwavering loyalty to a man who rarely shows affection, gratitude, or emotional attachment? The answer is complicated, because Sukuna does not experience relationships the way most people do. For ordinary individuals, companionship is often built upon trust, affection, shared struggles, or emotional connection. Sukuna appears to have little need for any of those things. He does not seek comfort from others. He does not rely on emotional support. He does not appear afraid of loneliness, nor does he seem burdened by the isolation that accompanies overwhelming power. And yet, Urame remains. Historical details about Urame's origins are scarce, but it is known that they served Sukuna during the Heian Era and continued preserving that loyalty even after centuries had passed. In a story where alliances are fragile and ambitions frequently change, such devotion is extraordinarily rare. Entire clans rise and fall. Sorcerers betray one another. Political loyalties shift according to circumstance. Yet Urame's loyalty to Sukuna never appears to waver. What makes this even more remarkable is Sukuna's response. He does not reject Urame. This may sound like a small detail, but for Sukuna, it is deeply significant. He tolerates very few people. He dismisses weakness mercilessly. He grows bored with most individuals almost immediately. Yet Urame consistently remains within his inner circle, suggesting that Sukuna sees something valuable in their presence, even if he would never describe it in sentimental terms. This dynamic reveals an important aspect of Sukuna's personality that is easy to overlook. Despite his cruelty, Sukuna is not irrational. He respects competence. He values loyalty when it serves him. He appreciates individuals who understand their place in the world and do not burden him with expectations or demands. Urame embodies these qualities perfectly. Their loyalty is absolute. Their abilities are formidable, and they never attempt to challenge Sukuna's worldview. Rather than asking him to change, Urame accepts him completely, embracing the terrifying reality of who he is without hesitation or judgment. In many ways, this may be the closest Sukuna comes to companionship. Not friendship in the conventional sense, not love, not emotional dependence, but a quiet acknowledgement that there exists another individual whose presence he neither resents nor seeks to escape. That subtle distinction says a great deal about Sukuna, because for all his arrogance and brutality, he is not entirely disconnected from other people. He simply experiences relationships through a fundamentally different lens. Most people search for equals. Sukuna does not believe equals exist. Most people seek emotional intimacy. Sukuna seeks freedom above all else. Most people fear isolation. Sukuna embraces it so completely that the idea of relying on others feels almost alien to him. This perspective likely developed during the Heian Era itself. Imagine existing in a world where nobody can challenge you. Imagine possessing so much strength that ordinary conflicts lose all meaning. Imagine living among countless talented sorcerers while knowing that none of them truly understand your experience. Such overwhelming superiority would inevitably create distance. The stronger Sukuna became, the fewer people could relate to him. The fewer people could relate to him, the less interested he became in human relationships altogether. Over time, isolation ceased being a consequence of his power and instead became part of his identity. This may explain why Sukuna rarely expresses emotions associated with regret or longing. He does not appear saddened by his loneliness because he does not perceive it as loneliness. From his perspective, most human relationships are temporary, fragile, and constrained by emotions he considers weaknesses. Freedom requires detachment, and Sukuna values freedom more than almost anything else. There is something strangely tragic hidden within this worldview. Not because Sukuna suffers from it. He clearly does not. The tragedy lies in the realization that someone so overwhelmingly powerful may have sacrificed entire aspects of ordinary human experience without ever viewing that sacrifice as a loss. He does not seek understanding because he assumes nobody could understand him. He does not pursue affection because affection offers him nothing he values. He has become so completely self-sufficient that emotional connection appears almost irrelevant. This makes Sukuna fundamentally different from many other antagonists. Characters like Geto, Gojo, and even Kenjaku are shaped by their relationships with others. Their beliefs evolve through friendships, rivalries, disappointments, and personal experiences. Sukuna, by contrast, seems almost untouched by these forces. His worldview remains astonishingly stable because it is built upon a single, unwavering belief. The strong exist for themselves. The weak exist beneath them. And the only life worth living is one completely free from the expectations of others. This philosophy made Sukuna terrifying during the Heian Era, but it also made him strangely isolated. While other sorcerers fought for ideals, families, or futures they hoped to create, Sukuna stood apart from all of them, pursuing nothing beyond his own desires and refusing to acknowledge any authority greater than his own will. Yet there was another figure living during this same era whose ambitions stretched far beyond personal freedom. A man who feared stagnation more than death. A man who viewed humanity not as individuals, but as an experiment waiting to be perfected. A man who would survive the fall of the Heian Era itself and spend centuries manipulating history from behind the scenes. His name was Kenjaku, and in many ways, his plans would prove even more ambitious than Sukuna's power. If Ryomen Sukuna was the greatest force of destruction the Heian Era ever produced, then Kenjaku was something far more unsettling. Sukuna's power was obvious. His strength overwhelmed opponents openly and decisively. Entire generations feared him because they knew exactly what he was capable of. Kenjaku, by contrast, inspired a different kind of fear, one born not from brute strength alone, but from patience, intelligence, and an ambition so vast that even centuries felt insignificant compared to the plans unfolding inside his mind. The most frightening thing about Kenjaku is not that he lived for 1,000 years. It is what he chose to do with that time. Long before the events of Jujutsu Kaisen, long before Gojo, Yuji, or even many of the great clans reached their modern forms, Kenjaku was already shaping history from behind the scenes. Through his cursed technique, which allowed him to transplant his brain into other bodies and take control of them, he escaped the natural limits of human life. While generations of sorcerers grew old and died, Kenjaku simply moved from one life to another, carrying his memories, ambitions, and experiments across centuries. At first glance, immortality might seem like the ultimate advantage. For Kenjaku, it became an obsession, because when someone lives long enough, ordinary ambitions begin to lose their meaning. Wealth becomes temporary. Political influence becomes fleeting. Even entire civilizations rise and fall before one's eyes. Over time, Kenjaku stopped viewing people as individuals with hopes and fears. Instead, he began seeing humanity itself as a vast experiment, a species whose potential remained frustratingly incomplete. This belief became the foundation of everything he would do. Unlike Sukuna, who embraced his own desires without caring about the future of humanity, Kenjaku became fascinated by evolution. He believed humanity possessed untapped possibilities, hidden within cursed energy. And he grew increasingly frustrated by how slowly people changed. Sorcerers repeated the same traditions. Clans preserved the same structures. Society clung to familiar patterns. From Kenjaku's perspective, humanity was stagnant, and stagnation was intolerable. This philosophy made him extraordinarily dangerous because Kenjaku was willing to sacrifice anything in pursuit of progress. Morality held little meaning for him. Individual lives held even less. Throughout the centuries, he conducted experiments so disturbing that even other villains within the series appear horrified by their implications. Entire bloodlines became pieces on his chessboard. Countless people suffered because they happened to serve his goals. What makes these actions especially terrifying is that Kenjaku rarely behaves like a madman. He is calm, patient, intelligent. He speaks casually about tragedies that span centuries because his perspective has become detached from ordinary human experience. When someone lives for over 1,000 years, decades begin to feel brief. Individual lives become fleeting moments. Entire generations appear and disappear while the larger plan continues moving forward. This detachment gradually transformed Kenjaku into something difficult to classify. He was not simply a sorcerer. he was not merely an immortal. He became an observer of history itself, someone standing outside the normal flow of human life and manipulating events according to his own vision of the future. The Heian Era provided fertile ground for these ambitions. This was already the strongest age of Jujutsu, an era overflowing with exceptional sorcerers, rare techniques, and dangerous experiments. The boundaries of cursed energy were still being explored. Ancient techniques flourished. Powerful clans competed for influence. Extraordinary individuals emerged with astonishing frequency. For Kenjaku, this environment was irresistible. He studied people endlessly. He observed the rise of powerful bloodlines. He examined cursed techniques across generations. He became fascinated by the relationship between negative emotions and human evolution, gradually forming theories that would guide his actions for centuries. In many ways, Kenjaku resembles a scientist unconstrained by ethics. The problem is that his laboratory is humanity itself. This becomes painfully clear when examining some of his most infamous actions. The creation of the death-painting wombs, the manipulation of bloodlines, the experiments involving cursed objects, and eventually the culling game all stem from the same underlying obsession. Kenjaku wanted to force humanity to evolve, regardless of the suffering required to achieve that goal. The people caught in these experiments were rarely viewed as individuals. They were data, possibilities, stepping stones toward something greater. This mindset reveals a profound contrast between Kenjaku and Sukuna. Sukuna destroys because he enjoys exercising his freedom. Kenjaku manipulates because he believes he is guiding the future. Sukuna acts according to impulse. Kenjaku acts according to plans spanning centuries. One represents absolute power. The other represents absolute ambition. Neither worldview leaves much room for ordinary human compassion. Yet there is an irony hidden within Kenjaku's character that makes him strangely tragic. For someone obsessed with humanity's future, he gradually loses touch with humanity itself. The longer he lives, the less capable he becomes of understanding ordinary emotions. Relationships become transactional. Suffering becomes abstract. Death becomes commonplace. While he speaks endlessly about humanity's potential, he rarely treats individual humans as people deserving dignity or care. His curiosity grows larger. His empathy grows smaller. Over time, the experiment becomes more important than the subjects. This transformation may have begun during the Heian Era itself. Living alongside monsters like Sukuna, witnessing countless deaths, and observing centuries of conflict gradually reshaped the way Kenjaku viewed existence. He stopped asking what was morally right and started asking what was possible. If something could advance his goals, then almost any cost became acceptable. That question, what is possible, would eventually reshape the entire world of Jujutsu Kaisen. Because while Sukuna terrified the Heian Era through overwhelming strength, Kenjaku was quietly creating plans whose consequences would echo for 1,000 years. He would manipulate bloodlines, orchestrate tragedies, and engineer events so complex that many participants would never realize they were pieces in his design. And perhaps the most astonishing part of his story is that despite all his intelligence, despite all his preparation, and despite surviving longer than almost anyone in history, Kenjaku never truly sought peace. He sought change, constantly, relentlessly, because after outliving generations, witnessing empires rise and fall, and accumulating knowledge beyond imagination, he arrived at a terrifying conclusion. Humanity was not finished evolving, and he intended to force that evolution himself, no matter how many lives would be consumed in the process. When later generations refer to the Heian Era as the golden age of sorcery, they are not exaggerating. No other period in the history of Jujutsu Kaisen produced such a concentration of extraordinary talent. Ancient cursed techniques flourished during this era. Elite sorcerers pushed their abilities to heights that later generations would struggle to replicate. Entire bloodlines rose to prominence because they possessed powers so rare and refined that their descendants would spend centuries trying to preserve them. The Heian Era was brutal, unforgiving, and relentlessly violent. Yet it was precisely these conditions that forced humanity to evolve beyond anything that had come before. This was an age where greatness was not admired from a distance. It was required for survival. The sorcerers of the Heian Era lived under constant pressure. Powerful curses roamed the land freely. Ancient spirits threatened entire regions, and figures such as Ryomen Sukuna existed as terrifying reminders that even the strongest individuals could find themselves hopelessly outmatched. Every battle carried enormous risks, and this reality forced sorcerers to become stronger at an astonishing pace. The result was a generation of fighters unlike anything seen in modern times. Many of the techniques that later became famous throughout the Jujutsu world either originated during this era or reached their highest level of refinement here. Domain expansions were not considered mythical abilities, reserved for a select few. They represented an essential aspect of elite combat. Sorcerers trained relentlessly to perfect their techniques because partial mastery was often indistinguishable from failure. Battles between powerful fighters were not merely contests of strength. They were clashes of intelligence, creativity, cursed energy control, and generations of accumulated knowledge. The gap between ordinary sorcerers and the elite was enormous. The gap between the elite and the monsters of the Heian Era was even greater. This is one of the reasons modern sorcerers speak about the era with a mixture of admiration and unease. While contemporary Jujutsu society certainly possesses remarkable individuals, the sheer concentration of power during the Heian Era remains almost unbelievable. Ancient fighters who have reappeared during the culling game serve as living reminders of this reality. Even after centuries have passed, many of them remain extraordinarily dangerous, possessing abilities refined through battles that modern sorcerers can scarcely imagine. Take someone like Kashimo Hajime. Although his exact origins lie toward the later years of Jujutsu history, rather than the center of the Heian Era itself, his mindset perfectly reflects the philosophy of ancient sorcerers. Kashimo devoted his life entirely to combat, constantly searching for opponents worthy of his strength. He cared little for politics, status, or comfort, because battle itself became the defining purpose of his existence. His eventual desire to challenge Sukuna speaks volumes about the mentality of powerful ancient sorcerers. They lived in a world where strength was the ultimate measure of worth, and many dedicated their entire lives to pursuing it. This attitude was common during the Golden Age. Sorcerers were not merely protectors. They were survivors of an extraordinarily violent age. Every victory carried scars. Every loss carried consequences. Every battle demanded absolute commitment. Because of this environment, fighters developed an almost frightening level of adaptability. They studied cursed energy obsessively. They experimented with techniques that later generations considered impossible. They analyzed opponents with extraordinary precision, because understanding the enemy often meant the difference between survival and death. At the same time, the Heian Era was not simply an age of individual greatness. It was an age of bloodlines. The foundations of the great clans grew stronger during this period because inherited techniques provided enormous advantages. Families possessing exceptional abilities gained influence, resources, and prestige. Over generations, these advantages compounded, allowing certain clans to dominate the structure of Jujutsu society. The ancestors of the Gojo clan cultivated techniques so powerful that their descendants would remain among the strongest sorcerers in history. The Kamo clan refined blood manipulation into one of the most versatile and feared inherited techniques ever created. The Zenin clan produced generations of talented fighters while establishing traditions centered around strength and discipline, even when those traditions sometimes became cruel. These families understood an uncomfortable truth. Power rarely exists in isolation. It accumulates. It is preserved. And once established, it shapes society for generations. The consequences of this system can still be seen in the modern era, where inherited techniques continue influencing status, opportunities, and expectations. The seeds of many contemporary conflicts were planted during the Heian Era, when the pursuit of strength gradually transformed into rigid social hierarchies that valued exceptional abilities above almost everything else. Yet even among these powerful families, there remained a constant source of anxiety. Ryomen Sukuna. No matter how influential a clan became, no matter how refined their techniques were, Sukuna existed as an uncomfortable reminder that there were limits to inherited power. Entire bloodlines dedicated centuries to cultivating strength, yet one individual still stood beyond them all. The strongest era in history produced countless legends, but Sukuna remained the standard against which every other sorcerer was measured. This reality had a profound psychological effect upon the age. It forced sorcerers to ask difficult questions. What does it mean to pursue strength if someone infinitely stronger already exists? Can power alone create happiness? Does surpassing others actually bring fulfillment? Or does the endless pursuit of strength simply create more loneliness? Different sorcerers answered these questions in different ways. Some pursued greater power relentlessly. Some devoted themselves to their clans. Some searched for meaning beyond combat. Others surrendered themselves entirely to ambition. The Heian Era became a stage where these philosophies collided, producing stories of triumph, tragedy, obsession, and sacrifice that would echo for centuries. This complexity is part of what makes the Golden Age so fascinating. It was not merely an era filled with powerful fighters. It was an era where extraordinary people struggled to understand what their strength was actually for. Some found answers. Many did not. And among all of them, perhaps no one embodied this struggle more completely than the society they collectively created. A world where power determined status, where death was a constant companion, and where the cost of greatness was often far higher than anyone wished to admit. To understand the true brutality of the Heian Era, however, it is not enough to study its strongest sorcerers. We must also examine the society that created them, because behind every legendary fighter stood a system that demanded sacrifice, rewarded strength, and often treated human lives as expendable in pursuit of a greater ideal. The Heian Era is remembered as the golden age of sorcery because it produced the strongest generation of jujutsu users in history. But that title often hides an uncomfortable truth. This age was golden only for those fortunate enough to survive it. And survival came at a tremendous cost. Behind the legendary battles, the extraordinary cursed techniques, and the famous names preserved throughout history, existed a society built upon relentless competition, immense pressure, and sacrifices that began the moment a child was born. For sorcerers, childhood was rarely a time of innocence. From an early age, children born into powerful families were taught that their lives belonged not entirely to themselves, but to their clan and the responsibilities attached to their bloodline. Their worth was measured according to the cursed techniques they inherited, the potential they displayed, and the future they could provide for their family. Talented children were praised, but that praise often came with crushing expectations. Those considered weak or lacking potential were frequently ignored, marginalized, or treated as disappointments regardless of their character or ambitions. This harsh mentality did not emerge because the great clans were uniquely cruel. It emerged because the Heian Era itself was unforgiving. When curses threatened entire communities and powerful sorcerers died young, families became obsessed with preserving strength. They viewed inherited techniques as essential tools for survival, and gradually began organizing every aspect of society around maintaining those advantages. Marriages became strategic alliances designed to strengthen bloodlines. Children became investments in the future of the clan. Individual desires were often sacrificed for the sake of preserving traditions that had existed for generations. The consequences of this system were profound. Many sorcerers spent their entire lives attempting to live up to expectations imposed upon them long before they were old enough to understand them. Failure carried enormous social consequences because weakness affected not only the individual, but also the reputation of their entire family. Success brought prestige, yet it rarely brought freedom. The stronger a sorcerer became, the more responsibility they carried, and the more others expected from them. This pressure shaped personalities in different ways. Some individuals embraced their duties completely, finding purpose in protecting their families and preserving their traditions. Others became consumed by ambition, viewing strength as the only reliable source of value in a dangerous world. Still others struggled under expectations they never chose, quietly enduring burdens that few people around them truly understood. The tragedy is that many of these struggles remained hidden. Jujutsu society admired strength, but it rarely asked what sacrifices were required to obtain it. It celebrated powerful techniques while ignoring the emotional costs carried by those expected to wield them. It praised gifted children while quietly stripping them of the freedom to define their own futures. This contradiction became one of the defining characteristics of the Heian Era. The age produced greatness, but greatness often demanded suffering. This reality extended beyond the great clans themselves. Independent sorcerers faced equally difficult lives. Without the protection of powerful families, they relied entirely upon their own abilities to survive. Dangerous missions were commonplace. Injuries were frequent. Death could arrive suddenly. And many sorcerers accepted this reality so completely that they stopped imagining long futures for themselves. They lived intensely because they understood how fragile their lives truly were. Friendships formed quickly under such circumstances. So did grief. The loss of companions became an unavoidable part of life, and over time, many sorcerers developed emotional defenses that allowed them to continue fighting despite repeated tragedies. Some became detached. Others became obsessed with growing stronger, so they would never again experience helplessness. A few retained their compassion despite everything they witnessed, but even they carried scars that never fully healed. This culture of constant struggle produced extraordinary warriors. It also produced extraordinary loneliness. Because while the Heian Era celebrated power, power itself often created isolation. The strongest sorcerers found fewer and fewer people capable of understanding their experiences. Responsibilities increased as abilities grew. Expectations multiplied. The gap separating exceptional individuals from ordinary society widened until many elite sorcerers existed in a world almost entirely their own. No figure embodies this isolation more clearly than Ryomen Sukuna. Although Sukuna willingly embraced his separation from humanity, his existence exposed a painful truth about the era. The pursuit of absolute strength often required sacrifices extending far beyond physical hardship. It demanded emotional distance, relentless ambition, and the gradual abandonment of ordinary human experiences that many people take for granted. This was not unique to Sukuna. The entire structure of Jujutsu society encouraged these sacrifices. Sorcerers learned to suppress fear because hesitation could prove fatal. They learned to hide vulnerability because weakness invited exploitation. They learned to prioritize missions over personal happiness because countless lives depended upon their success. Over time, These habits became deeply ingrained within the culture itself. The result was a society filled with remarkable individuals who frequently struggled to live ordinary lives. This tension can still be seen in modern Jujutsu Kaisen. Characters like Gojo Satoru, Geto Suguru, and even Megumi Fushiguro continue grappling with problems rooted in traditions established centuries earlier. Expectations tied to bloodlines remain powerful. The burden of inherited techniques continues shaping lives. Sorcerers still face impossible responsibilities while attempting to preserve their humanity within a system that often values their abilities more than their well-being. The Heian Era may have ended long ago, but the structures it created never truly disappeared. Its values survived. Its traditions endured. Its hierarchies remained intact. This is one of the reasons the golden age of sorcery feels both magnificent and tragic at the same time. The era produced extraordinary achievements, yet it also established systems that demanded immense sacrifices from generation after generation. Greatness flourished, but it flourished within a world where suffering was normalized and where strength frequently mattered more than happiness. Even the greatest sorcerers were not immune to these pressures. Many carried regrets they never voiced. Many sacrificed futures they secretly desired. Many achieved everything they were expected to achieve, and still found themselves searching for meaning beyond power. The Heian Era celebrated strength more than any age before or after it. But beneath that celebration existed a quiet sadness that touched nearly everyone living within it. Sorcerers devoted their lives to protecting humanity, yet often struggled to protect themselves from loneliness, exhaustion, and the burdens imposed by the very society they served. And perhaps nowhere was this contradiction more visible than in the desperate struggle against Ryomen Sukuna, because the greatest sorcerers in history would eventually unite against a single opponent, risking everything they possessed in an attempt to stop a man whose existence challenged the very foundations of the world they had spent their entire lives trying to protect. By the height of the Heian Era, Ryomen Sukuna was no longer simply regarded as an exceptionally powerful sorcerer. He had become a crisis. His name spread throughout the country, not because of rumors or exaggerated legends, but because entire regions had witnessed the consequences of his existence firsthand. Sorcerers spoke about him with caution. Powerful clans monitored his movements with anxiety. Ordinary people whispered stories that painted him as something closer to a divine punishment than a man. The fear surrounding Sukuna reached such extraordinary levels that even in an age overflowing with talent, people began asking a question that would define an entire generation. If Sukuna could not be stopped, what future did humanity have? This question haunted the strongest sorcerers of the Heian Era because they understood something that ordinary people did not. Sukuna was not merely stronger than most opponents. He was operating on an entirely different level of existence. His cursed energy was overwhelming. His understanding of Jujutsu seemed almost limitless. His battle instincts bordered on perfection. Worst of all, he fought without fear, hesitation, or emotional attachments that enemies could exploit. He possessed immense power. He understood how to use it, and he enjoyed doing so. Against such an opponent, courage alone was meaningless. The Heian Era eventually reached a point where individual challenges ceased making sense. One talented sorcerer after another had attempted to confront Sukuna, and one after another had failed. Great techniques that defined prestigious bloodlines proved ineffective. Skilled fighters, whose names would have become legends under different circumstances, disappeared from history after encountering him. The reality became impossible to ignore. No single sorcerer could defeat Ryomen Sukuna. For perhaps the first time in Jujutsu history, rival clans and powerful fighters who normally competed against one another found themselves sharing a common goal. Old rivalries became less important. Political disagreements became secondary. Personal ambitions were temporarily set aside because the threat before them was too great for anyone to ignore. The strongest era in history began preparing for war. Unfortunately, many details surrounding this conflict have been lost to time. Gege Akutami deliberately leaves large portions of the Heian Era shrouded in mystery, allowing Sukuna's legend to feel even larger than the surviving records themselves. Yet the fragments that remain reveal enough to paint a chilling picture. The greatest sorcerers of the age united against one man, and they lost. This outcome is difficult to fully appreciate because modern readers often underestimate how extraordinary Heian Era sorcerers truly were. These were not inexperienced fighters. They belonged to the most powerful generation in Jujutsu history. Many possessed techniques that modern sorcerers can scarcely imagine. They had survived countless battles against curses and rival sorcerers alike. Their understanding of cursed energy had been refined through decades of warfare. Yet even together, they could not overcome Sukuna. This failure reshaped the psychology of Jujutsu society. For centuries, strength had been regarded as the answer to every problem. If a curse appeared, sorcerers trained harder. If enemies grew stronger, techniques evolved. If one generation failed, the next generation aimed higher. The assumption underlying this philosophy was simple. Eventually, humanity would become strong enough to overcome any obstacle. Sukuna shattered that belief. His existence suggested that there were limits to human progress, that some mountains could not be climbed, that some enemies existed beyond conventional understanding. The emotional impact of this realization cannot be overstated. Imagine devoting your entire life to becoming stronger, inheriting generations of knowledge, mastering techniques beyond ordinary comprehension, and then discovering that none of it is enough. Imagine witnessing the greatest fighters of your age standing together and realizing they are still hopelessly outmatched. That despair became part of Sukuna's legend. He did not merely defeat people. He defeated certainty. He defeated the belief that effort alone could solve every problem. He forced humanity to confront its own limitations. Yet perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this conflict is Sukuna's attitude throughout it all. He does not seem burdened by the role he plays in history. He does not view himself as a conqueror. He does not seek domination for political reasons. In many ways, Sukuna approaches these battles with the detached confidence of someone who never truly doubts the outcome. Opponents challenge him because they have no choice. Sukuna accepts those challenges because they amuse him. The imbalance between these perspectives creates an atmosphere that feels deeply unsettling because it suggests that even the most desperate struggles of others are little more than entertainment from his point of view. This indifference may be the most frightening aspect of his personality. Cruel people often possess motives. They seek revenge. They seek validation. They seek power. Sukuna seeks freedom. He destroys because he chooses to. He kills because he wishes to. And he refuses to justify those choices to anyone. This philosophy makes him terrifying, not only as an opponent, but as an idea. He exists completely outside the moral structures that guide ordinary people. Concepts such as justice, duty, sacrifice, or responsibility hold little meaning for him because he recognizes no authority greater than his own will. The Heian Era spent years trying to oppose that worldview. It never truly succeeded. Eventually, however, something extraordinary happened. Sukuna disappeared from the world. The details surrounding his downfall remain among the greatest mysteries in Jujutsu Kaisen. Historical records confirm that he was never defeated in the conventional sense. Even after death, his body remained so powerful that sorcerers could not destroy it. Instead, his remains were divided into 20 indestructible fingers, each becoming an extraordinarily dangerous, cursed object capable of preserving fragments of his immense power. This solution was less a victory than a compromise. Humanity could not destroy Sukuna. It could only contain him. The fingers were scattered throughout the world, hidden away in hopes that future generations would never have to confront the nightmare their ancestors failed to overcome. Yet even as the Heian Era slowly faded into history, many sorcerers quietly feared the same possibility. What if Sukuna was not truly gone? What if a being so powerful could never be erased completely? What if the greatest threat in history was merely waiting for an opportunity to return? Centuries would pass. Entire generations would live and die. The golden age of sorcery would become legend. But the fear surrounding Sukuna never truly disappeared. Because deep within the foundations of Jujutsu society remained an uncomfortable truth that nobody wanted to admit. The strongest era in history had thrown everything it possessed against Ryomen Sukuna. And despite all of its talent, courage, and sacrifice, it still could not guarantee that he would never return. The Heian Era is often remembered as though it ended in a single, dramatic moment. As though one final battle concluded the Age of Legends and allowed history to move peacefully into the future. The truth is far more complicated and in many ways far more tragic. The golden age of sorcery did not collapse overnight. It faded slowly, almost imperceptibly, as the people who defined it gradually disappeared, and the world they built became impossible to sustain. By the time Ryomen Sukuna vanished from history, and his remains were sealed away as cursed objects, the Heian Era had already begun changing. The generation of sorcerers who fought during its most brutal years was growing older. Countless powerful fighters had died in battles whose details would eventually be forgotten. Ancient techniques that once flourished freely became increasingly rare as families lost members, bloodlines weakened, and secret knowledge disappeared along with the people who possessed it. For centuries, the Heian Era had pushed sorcerers to extraordinary heights. But greatness extracted a terrible price. Many of the strongest individuals never lived long lives. Their names survived, but their experiences did not. Their techniques were remembered, but the countless sacrifices required to master them slowly faded from public memory. Stories became legends. Legends became myths. And over time, even the most extraordinary accomplishments began losing their original context. This is one of the great tragedies of history. People remember victories. They remember famous names. They remember legends. But they often forget the fear, loneliness, and suffering that shaped those legends in the first place. The Heian Era was filled with remarkable individuals, yet many of them lived lives marked by violence and sacrifice. Sorcerers dedicated themselves to protecting humanity while accepting that they might die young. Powerful clans accumulated prestige while burdening future generations with increasingly rigid expectations. Families preserved inherited techniques obsessively because they feared losing the advantages that had allowed them to survive. Over time, this obsession with preservation gradually transformed Jujutsu society itself. The world became more structured. The great clans became more influential. Traditions became stricter. Rules replaced instincts. What had once been a chaotic age, overflowing with extraordinary talent, slowly evolved into a society focused on maintaining order and preserving stability. This transition brought advantages. Sorcerers benefited from more organized institutions. Knowledge could be passed down more systematically. The most dangerous cursed objects were cataloged and hidden away. The lessons learned through centuries of hardship were carefully preserved. Yet something was lost in the process. The Heian Era had been terrifying, but it had also been alive with possibility. Ancient sorcerers constantly pushed the boundaries of cursed energy. They experimented fearlessly, developed new techniques, and challenged accepted limitations because survival demanded innovation. Later generations inherited the results of these efforts, but they rarely inherited the same willingness to risk everything in pursuit of progress. The age of pioneers slowly gave way to the age of caretakers. This shift affected the great clans as well. The ancestors who built these families were often extraordinary individuals forced to overcome impossible circumstances. Their descendants inherited prestige, influence, and powerful techniques, but they also inherited expectations that gradually became restrictive. Preserving tradition became more important than embracing change. Protecting status became more important than pursuing innovation. Ironically, the very institutions created to ensure survival sometimes became obstacles to growth. The Gojo clan continued guarding the Six Eyes and Limitless. The Kamo clan continued preserving blood manipulation. The Zenin clan continued measuring worth through strength. Generation after generation, repeated patterns established centuries earlier, often without questioning whether those traditions still served the people living under them. This tension would eventually become one of the defining conflicts of modern Jujutsu Kaisen. Because while the Heian Era ended, its influence never truly disappeared. Its values remained. Its hierarchies remained. Its fears remained. Its mistakes remained. Even centuries later, characters like Gojo Satoru and Suguru Geto would struggle against systems created during the golden age of sorcery. The expectations placed upon gifted children, the obsession with inherited techniques, the rigid structures of the great clans, and the tendency to value strength above emotional well-being all trace their origins back to this era. The Heian Era became history. Its problems did not. Perhaps nowhere is this more apparent than in the legacy of Ryomen Sukuna himself. Although his body disappeared, his influence lingered throughout the centuries. The 20 fingers left behind became objects of fear and fascination. Sorcerers devoted enormous resources to hiding them, guarding them, and preventing anyone from ever awakening the being who had once terrorized the strongest era in history. The fact that such precautions remained necessary speaks volumes. Most enemies are defeated. Most disasters eventually end. Most fears fade with time. Sukuna did none of those things. Even in death, he remained dangerous. Even in silence, his name inspired fear. Even after centuries had passed, Jujutsu Society continued organizing itself around the possibility of his return. That lingering fear became part of the world's foundation. And Sukuna was not the only shadow cast by the Heian Era. Kenjaku also endured. While others died and became legends, Kenjaku continued moving through history, quietly observing the changes taking place around him. He watched powerful clans solidify their influence. He watched Jujutsu Society become increasingly rigid. He watched generations repeat familiar patterns while believing they were moving toward progress. And all the while, he continued planning. This may be the most remarkable aspect of the Golden Age's ending. The era itself disappeared. The people who defined it disappeared. The battles faded into legend. Yet the two individuals who shaped it more than anyone else continued influencing the world long after its conclusion. One through fear, the other through manipulation. Their shadows stretched across centuries. Meanwhile, the world moved forward, believing the age of monsters had passed. But history has a strange way of repeating itself. The techniques born during the Heian Era remained alive. The bloodlines remained alive. The ambitions remained alive. The fears remained alive. And hidden beneath the surface of modern Jujutsu Society was an uncomfortable truth that very few people fully appreciated. The golden age of sorcery had never truly ended. Its greatest battles were simply waiting to be fought again by a new generation. because some eras disappear completely. The Heian Era became something far more dangerous. It became a legacy. And centuries later, that legacy would return to reshape the world once more in ways that nobody could have imagined. Although more than 1,000 years separate the modern world of Jujutsu Kaisen from the Heian Era, the distance between them is far smaller than it first appears. In many ways, modern Jujutsu society is not a new civilization at all. It is an inheritance, built upon foundations established during the golden age of sorcery, and still shaped by decisions made by people who have been dead for centuries. The techniques, traditions, political structures, and even the fears that define the present all trace their origins back to that ancient era, making the Heian period less of a historical chapter and more of a shadow that continues stretching across time. The clearest example of this legacy can be seen in the great clans. The Gojo clan, the Zenin clan, and the Kamo clan did not simply survive the Heian era. They carried its values into the future and transformed them into institutions that would dominate Jujutsu society for generations. Their inherited techniques remained among the most coveted abilities in existence. Their bloodlines continued shaping the destinies of countless children. Their influence expanded far beyond individual families, gradually becoming woven into the political and social fabric of the entire Jujutsu world. Yet the values these clans preserved were not always benevolent. The obsession with inherited power remained intact. The tendency to judge people according to their cursed techniques continued shaping opportunities and expectations. Children blessed with extraordinary abilities carried immense pressure from the moment they were born, while those lacking prestigious techniques often found themselves overlooked or marginalized. The same hierarchy that emerged during the Heian era continued influencing society centuries later, proving that traditions can survive long after people forget why those traditions existed in the first place. This inheritance affected nearly every major character in modern Jujutsu Kaisen. Gojo Satoru, despite being the strongest sorcerer of his age, spent much of his life struggling against systems established long before his birth. His overwhelming power gave him freedom in some respects, yet it also isolated him from others. Expectations surrounded him constantly because his existence carried enormous significance for the balance of the Jujutsu world. The burden of being exceptional, a burden that defined so many sorcerers during the Heian era, remained painfully relevant in the modern age. Megumi Fushiguro inherited similar pressures through the Zenin bloodline. Although he rejected many aspects of the clan's values, he could never fully escape the influence of traditions that had existed for centuries. His story demonstrates how deeply the past can shape an individual's life, even when that individual actively resists it. The Heian era may seem distant, but its values continued affecting choices, relationships, and destinies long after its end. Perhaps no modern character illustrates this connection more dramatically than Yuji Itadori. Yuji enters the story with almost no understanding of the ancient world that shaped his circumstances. He appears to be an ordinary teenager, Yet the moment he consumes Sukuna's finger, he becomes directly connected to the greatest terror of the Heian Era. Suddenly, history is no longer something distant and abstract. It becomes personal. The fears that haunted ancient sorcerers become Yuji's reality, and the consequences of decisions made centuries earlier begin unfolding once again. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of Jujutsu Kaisen as a story. The past is never truly gone. Ancient battles continue influencing modern conflicts. Old philosophies continue shaping contemporary values. Long-dead sorcerers continue affecting people who have never even heard their names. The world moves forward, but it carries its history with it. No figure embodies this idea more completely than Ryomen Sukuna. For most stories, the legendary villain belongs entirely to the past. Their actions become historical events, remembered through books and stories, but incapable of directly affecting the present. Sukuna is different. His fingers survived. His cursed energy survived. Most importantly, his presence survived. Even after centuries of absence, the fear surrounding him never disappeared, because deep down, Jujutsu society never truly believed he was gone forever. When Sukuna finally returns through Yuji, it feels less like a resurrection and more like the continuation of an unfinished story. The same terror that once gripped the Heian Era returns to the modern world. The same overwhelming strength reappears. The same questions emerge once again. How do you fight someone so powerful that history itself failed to stop him? How do you protect humanity against an opponent who exists outside ordinary morality? And perhaps most frightening of all, how do you prevent the mistakes of the past from repeating themselves? These questions haunt the modern generation just as they haunted the ancient one. Meanwhile, another figure from the Heian Era has been quietly preparing for this moment. Kenjaku's survival represents a different kind of legacy. While Sukuna embodies the terrifying endurance of raw power, Kenjaku represents the endurance of ambition. He spent centuries patiently shaping events, manipulating bloodlines, creating cursed objects, and guiding history toward goals so vast that entire generations unknowingly became participants in his plans. Few villains possess such extraordinary patience. Kenjaku watched empires rise and fall without abandoning his ambitions. He observed social structures evolve while quietly exploiting their weaknesses. He studied humanity for more than 1,000 years and ultimately concluded that people would never evolve naturally into something greater. If humanity refused to change on its own, then he would force that change regardless of the consequences. The culling game itself is evidence of this philosophy. What appears to be a modern crisis is in reality the culmination of plans originating during the Heian Era. Ancient sorcerers return to life. Forgotten techniques reappear. Long-buried conflicts resurface. The boundaries separating past and present begin collapsing, revealing how deeply intertwined these two worlds truly are. This realization transforms the way one views the golden age of sorcery. It was never simply a remarkable historical period. It was the foundation upon which everything else was built. Its greatest achievements shaped the future. Its greatest mistakes shaped the future as well. The brilliance of the Heian Era cannot be separated from the suffering it created, because both became inseparable parts of the legacy passed down through generations. Modern sorcerers inherit extraordinary techniques, but they also inherit ancient prejudices. They inherit powerful institutions, but they also inherit systems that frequently prioritize strength over compassion. They inherit legends, but they also inherit fears that have never fully disappeared. The world of Jujutsu Kaisen is therefore not a story about escaping history. It is a story about confronting it. Every generation must decide which parts of the past deserve preservation and which parts deserve to be left behind. Every generation must wrestle with traditions created under circumstances that no longer exist. Most importantly, every generation must ask whether the sacrifices demanded by previous eras are truly necessary, or whether a different future can finally be created. That question lies at the heart of the entire series. And perhaps nowhere is it more important than when looking back upon the Heian Era itself, an age so extraordinary, so brutal, and so influential that even after 1,000 years, the world still struggles to free itself from its shadow. After examining the rise of the great clans, the birth of Ryomen Sukuna, the ambitions of Kenjaku, the brutality of Jujutsu society, and the countless sacrifices demanded by the age, one conclusion becomes impossible to ignore. The Heian Era was not simply the golden age of sorcery, because it produced the strongest fighters in history. It earned that title because it pushed humanity to its absolute limits and revealed both the extraordinary heights people could reach and the terrible costs required to get there. This is what makes the Heian Era feel so different from every other period in Jujutsu Kaisen. It was not an age where good clearly triumphed over evil, nor was it a time when powerful heroes protected a peaceful world from external threats. Instead, it was a harsh and unforgiving era where survival itself demanded greatness, where curses grew stronger alongside sorcerers, and where nearly everyone carried burdens that would shape their lives forever. The people living during this period did not know they were creating legends. They did not realize future generations would study their techniques, preserve their names, and tell stories about their battles centuries after they were gone. They were simply trying to survive in a world that demanded extraordinary strength and offered very little mercy in return. That simple reality is what gives the Heian Era so much emotional weight, because beneath the myths and supernatural powers lies a deeply human story about fear, ambition, sacrifice, and the desperate struggle to create meaning in a dangerous world. The greatest sorcerers of the era were admired because they accomplished incredible things, but admiration often hides the loneliness many of them endured. Strength isolated people just as often as it empowered them. Powerful clans preserved their bloodlines, yet in doing so, they placed immense pressure upon future generations. Families protected their traditions, but those same traditions sometimes became chains that prevented people from choosing their own paths. The systems created during the Golden Age helped Jujutsu society survive, but they also created problems that would continue haunting the world 1,000 years later. No character embodies this contradiction more clearly than Ryomen Sukuna. Even now, Sukuna remains one of the most fascinating figures in modern anime because he cannot be explained through ordinary ideas of heroism or villainy. He is cruel, arrogant, and terrifyingly powerful. Yet he possesses a certainty about himself that few other characters can match. Sukuna does not pretend to be righteous. He does not seek approval, redemption, or understanding. He lives entirely according to his own desires, rejecting every limitation that society attempts to place upon him. That philosophy makes him horrifying. It also makes him the perfect product of the Heian Era, because Sukuna represents what happens when a world obsessed with strength creates someone who possesses more power than anyone else and decides that power alone is enough. He is not merely a villain within the story. He is the embodiment of the era's most dangerous values taken to their absolute extreme. Kenjaku, in his own way, serves a similar purpose. Where Sukuna embraced freedom, Kenjaku embraced ambition. He spent centuries manipulating history, experimenting with humanity, and pursuing goals so vast that ordinary morality became meaningless to him. His patience allowed him to outlive entire civilizations, yet the longer he lived, the further he drifted from ordinary human emotions. His story reveals another danger hidden within the Golden Age, namely that extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary power do not automatically create wisdom or compassion. Together, Sukuna and Kenjaku stand as reminders that greatness and destruction are often separated by a very thin line. This realization changes the way we think about the Heian Era itself. It was not simply an age of heroes. It was not simply an age of monsters. It was an age where humanity explored the furthest boundaries of what was possible, sometimes achieving incredible things, and sometimes creating horrors that future generations would spend centuries trying to overcome. The same era that gave birth to legendary sorcerers also created individuals whose influence would threaten the world long after their deaths. The same society that preserved extraordinary techniques also preserved traditions capable of causing tremendous suffering. This tension is why the Heian Era continues to feel so alive within Jujutsu Kaisen. Its history is not confined to the past. Its values still shape the great clans. Its conflicts still influence modern sorcerers. Its strongest figures still dominate conversations about power. Its fears still linger beneath the surface of the present. The modern world likes to believe it has moved beyond the problems of the Golden Age. Yet again and again, the story demonstrates that history is never truly left behind. Every generation inherits both the achievements and the mistakes of those who came before. Every generation must decide which traditions deserve preservation and which deserve to end. Every generation must wrestle with questions that have no easy answers. Can power exist without arrogance? Can strength exist without isolation? Can society preserve excellence without sacrificing compassion? The Heian Era never fully solved these questions. Perhaps that is why its story remains so compelling. Because despite all its greatness, despite all its legendary figures, and despite all the knowledge accumulated during centuries of struggle, the golden age of sorcery was still filled with ordinary human fears. People feared being forgotten. They feared weakness. They feared loneliness. They feared losing the people they cared about and failing to live up to the expectations placed upon them. Those fears are timeless. And maybe that is the reason the Heian Era continues captivating audiences more than 1,000 years after its fictional existence. Beneath the battles and supernatural abilities lies something surprisingly familiar. A world filled with people desperately searching for meaning while confronting forces far greater than themselves. Some became heroes. Some became monsters. Most became something in between. And together, they created an era so extraordinary, so brutal, and so influential that even after centuries have passed, the world of Jujutsu Kaisen still lives in the shadow of the golden age of sorcery.